welcome again. I think we're going to go ahead and get our program started. Thank you for coming tonight. I just want to quickly introduce who we are, and then I'm going to tell you about tonight's program. I'm here with Sylvester Brown Jr., and I am surrounded by Treasure Shields Redmond, Jasmine Mahmoud, and Vivian Gibson, who are our four writers speaking tonight. So thank you all for being here. Let me get back to my pages here. Thank you. So good evening. Welcome to the program Writing Hidden Histories of St. Louis, which is the first in a series of 6 public programs presented in conjunction with the 2021 Summer Writers Institute. My name is Sylvia Sukop. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am director of this year's institute. I am coming to you from University College at Washington University in St. Louis, and I am delighted that you have joined us for this very special evening. For the past 25 years, the Summer Writers Institute at WashU has been a place where writers gather to jumpstart new creative explorations, hone their craft skills, and build community among fellow writers. Our mission extends beyond the high quality instruction delivered by our diverse award-winning faculty to provide a welcoming, inclusive, and affirming space for writers of all backgrounds and ambitions. Before I introduce tonight's panelists, I want to take a moment to thank the leadership team here at University College, Heather Corcoran and Pat Matthews, for their incredible receptivity and support when I first proposed this free public program series. It's one of the silver linings of the Zoom era, being able to tap published writers and experts on writing and bring them together regardless of where they are living to share their wisdom with all of us. Tonight, among our presenters and our audience, we have representation from across the region and across the entire country. Writing is what prompted my own move to St. Louis back in 2016. I made the leap from Los Angeles, which had been my home of 2 decades, to enter the MFA writing program at WashU to study creative nonfiction. Before my move, I had just finished a project very close to my heart as a contributing writer to an anthology on hidden and forgotten histories of Los Angeles. An amazing chorus of often marginalized voices came together in a book titled Latitudes, an Angelino's Atlas. Now, as a relative newcomer to St. Louis, I am still learning about its many hidden histories and why and how they have been hidden. Tonight, we are proud to partner with Left Bank Books, the oldest independent bookseller in the city, to present 4 noted writers passionate about the St. Louis region who will share their journey to becoming writers while telling us how they have engaged with hidden histories. Before we begin, I want to thank one additional partner. Tonight's event is presented in collaboration with the American Culture Studies Department here at WashU in celebration of a new anthology of essays on the St. Louis region emerging from a multi-year initiative called The Material World of Modern Segregation, St. Louis in the Long Era of Ferguson. That anthology will be published this fall in a dedicated volume of Washington University's The Common Reader, a journal of the essay, edited by Gerald Early and guest co-edited by Iver Bernstein and Heidi Kolk, 2 important mentors who have helped me to deepen my own writing on neglected historical subjects. I'm honored that this forthcoming anthology will include an essay that I wrote about East St. Louis. So here's the plan for this evening. I will introduce all the presenters here at the beginning, and then they will each talk about their work about 10 minutes each. And then we'll come back together as a group for a discussion and to take your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your question at any point along the way in the evening. You don't have to wait till the Q&A begins. To make the most of our time, I'm going to read slightly abbreviated versions of the panelists' full bios, which you can find on the webpage for tonight's event. And I'm reading the names in order in which they will be presenting. Vivian Gibson was raised on Bernard Street in Mill Creek Valley, 454 acres in downtown St. Louis, which comprised the nation's largest urban renewal project beginning in 1959. She started writing short stories about her childhood memories of the dying community after retiring at age 66. Her memoir, The Last Children of Mill Creek, published when she was 70, won the Missouri Humanities Council 2021 Literary Achievement Award. Her work also appears in the St. Louis Anthology from Belt Publishing and in Plow Quarterly magazine. Sylvester Brown Jr., who's sitting here to my side, he is a former award-winning columnist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Prior to that, he published Take 5 magazine for 15 years. In 2020, he was awarded the Deaconess Foundation Fellowship to chronicle the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of Black St. Louisans for the St. Louis American newspaper. In 2012, Brown founded the Sweet Potato Project, a program that taught urban youth entrepreneurism through agriculture. In 2019, he self-published When We Listen, Recognizing the Potential of Urban Youth, and his latest book, White Castles with Jesus and Uncle Ray at the Used Tire Shop, a collection of his short stories and commentaries, came out in 2021. Treasure Shields Redmond, a Mississippi native, is a published poet, master educator, community arts organizer, and successful entrepreneur. She was raised in the federal housing projects and went on to be signed to MC Hammer's label as a hip hop artist and writer. The author of Chop, a collection of kwansabas for Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. Redmond co-founded Fannie Lou Hamer House, a retreat space for Black artists, and is the founder of Feminine Pronoun Consultants, LLC, and Get the Acceptance Letter Academy. Dr. Redmond was recently named a postdoctoral fellow of literary executorship for the estate of Dr. Eugene B. Redmond and the late Henry Dumas. And lastly, but not least, Jasmine Mahmoud is a curator, arts advocate, and historian of art and performance. In 2020, she curated abstractions of Black citizenship, African American art from St. Louis at Heidi Gallery in Seattle, centering works by 5 Black artists. Her essay, Citing Segregation, and that's spelled S-I-G-T-I-N-G, Citing Segregation, Black Aesthetics and the Materiality of Art in Ferguson, St. Louis, will be published in the Common Reader anthology I mentioned earlier. In addition to her essays and scholarly writing, Jasmine writes a monthly column centering BIPOC artists for the South Seattle Emerald and is starting a new job at University of Washington this fall. With that, let's get started. I first warmly welcome to the screen Vivian Gibson.
I knew I was going to do that. It is my pleasure to be here tonight and to talk about my memoir. As you mentioned, I came to writing rather late in life. I often introduce myself by saying I'm not a writer, but that's because I didn't set out to write a book. I wrote stories about my childhood throughout my adulthood. And after retiring, I decided to compile them. One day I was sitting at a red light at the intersection of Jefferson and Market and realized where I was, and realized that I had spent a good part of my childhood crossing those streets, going to school, going to church, having fun with my friends. And I thought, you know, there is absolutely nothing here that shows that 20,000 people once lived in this neighborhood called Mill Creek. And at that point, I decided maybe it was time to take some of those stories I'd been writing and compile them and share them, because I am at almost 70 when I started writing this book. I'm the youngest of my siblings, and I realized that if I didn't tell these stories, they wouldn't get told. So I'm really happy I made that decision. I want to try to share my screen, and let's hope it works. Yay. Okay. So I very quickly want to talk about the fact that whenever you see anything written about Mill Creek Valley, it's almost always this picture. And this is the mayor, Raymond Tucker, overlooking part of Mill Creek Valley in 1956. And in 1956, I was about 6 or 7 years old. And if he was looking at this in 1956, the actual bulldozers and wrecking balls didn't hit Mill Creek to start the demolition until 1959. So this is 3 years before. And this picture comes up all the time, but it doesn't really reflect the true full picture of Mill Creek. This is the Mill Creek that they wanted to show to persuade people that it should be blighted and it should be destroyed. They didn't show beautiful houses like these, or like this one, or beautiful churches like this one. This church is Berea Presbyterian Church. It is the only church of 40 churches that remain in Mill Creek. There are only 4 buildings of the 454 acres that you mentioned earlier. They don't show you the people who live there. This is my father at age 14 leaving Arkansas to be the first in his family to attend high school. They left the state and pursue his career as a singer and a musician, and to raise a family. And they don't show children. They don't show teenagers at dances. They don't show families. And so I really am happy that I'm able to talk about the people, the children of Mill Creek in my stories. So what I'd like to do for you right now before I go is to read a very brief excerpt from my book that gives you a sense of what it was like to live in that segregated community that was neglected, so that it could be blighted and actually be erased. So I'm going to read you a very short piece called "The Cat," and it sort of introduces you to the little girl who is telling the stories in my book. The cat. That's what they call the mottled gray muscular tabby that roamed the perimeter of our cold water 2-family dwelling we called home. It strode, brushing against the fences between the yards and the back alley, like a predator methodically patrolling its territory. I always knew it was there, but I didn't look directly at it. We never thought of the cat as a family pet. It was utilitarian, practical, like a farm animal. Its purpose was to control the rats. We didn't name it or touch it. We didn't feed it. Mama must have given it water and scraps during the day, which accounts for its loyalty to our house. All we wanted was for the cat to hunt rats at night. In late fall and winter, the rats came inside at night. Daddy and the boys plugged holes with steel wool, held in place with chicken wire, and hammered flattened tin cans in corners where the floor and the baseboards met. Huge, powerful rat traps had permanent positions in the stone wall basement where my brothers slept in the summer. On a brisk November evening, my brother Honey and I were sitting on the back steps, waiting for the last light of day to fade before we had to go inside for the night. The cat slowly emerged from behind the coal shed and at the far end of the backyard and paused, as if to indicate it was her yard now. Honey glanced up, and while rising from the step, he confessed to an unasked query. I'm more afraid of the cats than the rats, especially at night when they sound like babies crying in the alley. I was reassured to hear it was cats I heard at night and not babies. As if egged on by the cat's appearance, we entered our dimly lit kitchen and closed the door behind us. I slept every night with my clunky brown school shoes held snug against my chest. Other little 6-year-old girls might have been snuggled up with a rosy-cheeked doll or the soft pile of a well-loved teddy bear, not me. I didn't even like dolls and teddy bears. My shoes were my security against the threat of the mostly unseen nighttime rats that scurried across the floor or gnawed at something within the walls next to my bed. In a moderately successful attempt to curtail my bedwetting, I'd hold tightly to my trusty shoes just in case I had to get up and go to the toilet in the dark. With all the courage I could muster, I'd throw my shoe as hard as I could into the middle of the floor and wait for the rats to retreat deep into the walls. Everybody had their nighttime maneuvers for dealing with the rats. The older girls used the toilet before going to bed and didn't have to get up during the night. That didn't work for me. Mama said I had a small bladder. My brother Honey, who coached me on my nocturnal plan of action, slept with his trusty stick and could occasionally be heard striking a sharp blow to the floorboards. Sometimes at night, when all was finally quiet, there would be abrupt but familiar skirmishes, followed by a cacophony of screeching and squeaks and scratching claws and thumps and thuds. At first, I sucked in a sharp breath and stiffened. Then raising my head slightly to hear with both ears, my eyes opened wide against the darkness of the middle room, where I slept in one of 4 bunk beds. My younger brother Furman slept peacefully at the other end. Though staring at the night, I didn't want to see anything. My wide open eyes just made me more alert. I listened with my whole body. After a long, tense minute of quiet, I could hear the cat crunching on the bones of a dead rat. A calm washed over me. I relaxed. I was safe. The cat had done its job. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. I know we're going to go next to Sylvester Brown Jr. So here is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Vivian, I've got to get your book. Unlike Vivian and I share a lot. In fact, when I was 4 years old, I moved into the Pruitt-Agro housing complex, which was built for the poor people in the neighborhood. In fact, right after it was built, they started tearing down Mill Creek, if I'm correct. my road to writing has been very unorthodox. Never planned to be a writer, never had any interest in being a writer. What I was poor. My mother and father had 11 kids. My father was a chronic alcoholic with a third grade education. My mother had maybe a 10th grade education. Because of my father's alcoholism, he lost many jobs, and we moved from place to place to place, including Puerto Rico. We weren't just poor; we were po. We were peanut butter on a spoon for dinner, po. Uh, because of all that, because of the violence in Puerto Rico, because of the chaos in my life, because of the hunger, I depended on dreaming. So I was a young kid with an active imagination. I always, dreamed about stuff and looked at stuff and saw myself in the future. I didn't write, but I did draw. I was a cartoonist at a very early age. I drew my own comic books. And looking back, those comic books were really chronicling my life as a child, going to school, girlfriend, bullies, all that stuff. So I was doing comic books. And my mother loved the fact that I was a artist. We were also Jehovah's Witnesses. So I was that guy to come knocking on your door on Saturday mornings and you go run and hide. But at a very early age, I learned to put together stories. I learned to put together sermons. I learned to preach to people. And you had to be very creative in that. You couldn't just walk up and say, "Do you believe in God?" You had to find a personal way to get to them. Have you recently lost a loved one? Revelation 17:17 says you're going to see him again. So you had to find creative ways to introduce these scriptures. And I got very good at that at a very young age. I'm talking about 7. I stayed in a religion until I was, 16, 17, 18. I had dropped out of high school because going to school made no sense to me. What made sense to me was getting a job and going to work, and I did. Along that path, I picked up a lot of my father's tendencies. I was very reckless. I did the wine, women and song thing, except it wasn't wine. It was disco and other things. And I was on a very dangerous path. Dropped out of school, hanging out, having fun, irresponsible. But it was books that saved my life. I happened to go to work for the Cleve Gas Company as a digging holes, laying pipe. And my friend convinced me to go back to community college to study commercial art. In the meantime, I drifted into advertising and advertising sales. So I was doing designs for newspapers. I got hired to work for this, not hired as an internship for a free newspaper, just designing ads. But I walked into the library at Forest Park Community College, and I picked up a book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and it changed my life. It was the first time I read a book with a Black protagonist I could relate to. And I was 20 when I did it, 21 when I did this. Reading that book about an African American who had dealt with all the things that I had dealt with and more, and still came out of prison and impacted the world, lit a fire under me. I started reading everything I could get my hands on and learning about, because I knew nothing about the African American history. They didn't teach it in school. Being a Jehovah's Witness was they kind of frowned on anything what they deemed worldly. So this is my first time in 2021 learning about my history, learning about who I was, learning about slavery and the civil rights movement and all these heroic people. And I became very proud of who I was, very proud of what I represented. And it was then at Forest Park in 1987 that I decided I'm going to start up a publication. So no kid who looks like me, who shares my experiences, will be as ignorant as I was about my own history. It's called Take 5 Magazine. Ran it for 15 years. It never made money, but it won us a whole lot of awards. It also made, I became known in the community. It was because of Take 5 Magazine, the awards we won at these ceremonies at the Post-Dispatch paid attention to me. So when Greg Freeman, the columnist, passed away in 2002, I competed for that job and I got the job in 2003. Worked for the Post for 9 years. I have to say that I really wasn't what they were looking for. My truth was a little bit too hard and too steady, but I had to be me. So we parted ways in 2009. Wound up going to work for Tavis Smiley. Tavis wanted to hire me to work with some of his authors, and I did. And I went to Chicago and California, and I worked with the likes of Cornel West, Tom Burrell, Al Sharpton, all these world leaders, Black leaders. And I kept growing as a writer, because I kept challenging myself. I never really thought I was a very good writer, even though I won a bunch of awards and got jobs writing. I never really considered myself a writer. But what I really found out is that what I've always been trying to do is what I started to do in 1987, is tell our stories. I think the biggest hidden history in St. Louis is the history of African Americans. The Mill Creek story should be known, should be told. Even today, they keep us in this prism of poverty, crime, and welfare. Very seldom do we really break out and show there's humans and mothers and fathers and communities and soldiers and everybody doing their wonderful things. And so throughout my career, I've been trying to tell our story, trying to defend us against the stereotypes. And I guess that's become my niche. I published one book last year about, it was called When We Listen, Recognizing the Potential of Children, because I ran a program for young people that was eye-opening. We're teaching these young kids to be entrepreneurs with food, growing, selling, packaging food. And just getting to know them and their stories and their struggles, I became fans of these young people that we watch every day go through their struggles and go through their thing and don't realize how heroic they are. Just getting to school, just riding the bus, just choosing what colors you're going to wear in the morning. It's stories of heroism every day that we don't know about. So I'm going to read a passage. My new book is called White Castles with Jesus and Uncle Ray at the Used Tire Shop. It's a compilation of short stories I've written since the Take 5 days. This is one I think kind of speaks to what I just said about telling our story. It's called The Dope Man is Dead. It was written in March 2018. I am in mourning. The neighborhood dope dealer has been murdered. I know it's a strange thing to write. To most, the reaction to the death of an illegal drug peddler would be good riddance. I might have felt the same way had I not come to befriend the neighborhood dope man. About a year ago, I moved back to the city where I was born and raised. I'm going to be very vague in this story because I don't want to bring unwanted attention to my neighborhood or my neighbors. Let's just say I live in the heart of the hood. It's a typical low-income Black neighborhood where poverty is palpable and the sound of gunfire is routine. It's an area where life is dangerously beautiful. It's where mothers, fathers, and kids take buses in the wee hours of the morning to work or school. The area overflows with fast food restaurants, churches, and convenience stores owned by Middle Easterners who serve chips, candy, cigarettes, cell phones, and cheap, greasy food to a stranded demographic. It's an amalgamation of stubborn, elderly homeowners who band together to watch out or protect what's theirs from sometimes unruly, wandering young people. Like a ghetto version of the Game of Thrones, the shade tree mechanic, the nosy porch-sitting griot, the Vietnam vet with the mid-1970s Cadillac Coupe de Ville all serve as neighborhood watchmen. They are the observers and verbal warriors who keep tabs on the wildlings and the walking dead. I soon learned that the dope man, let's call him Zeke, my next door neighbor, was a Jon Snow-like character. Zeke was indeed the Lord Commander of this hobble of diligent urban night watchers. They all seemed to know him, like him even, and in a bizarre way depend on him to help manage the mess of which he was a participant. I learned the dangerous dynamics of my block very quickly. My first weekend there was accentuated with the sound of rapid fire gunplay down the street. I waited until the burst of bullets stopped before peeking through the blinds. There, walking down the street like Chuck Connors from the old Rifleman show, only instead of a rifle was Zeke, the dope man, holding an automatic weapon. The police never showed up. I saw him on our front porch a couple of days later and asked him what happened that day. Zeke feigned ignorance until I told him I saw him with the gun. Someone had followed him home after an altercation at a nightclub, he admitted. They shot at him and he returned fire until they sped off. He said nonchalantly, as if he was describing a fist fight. Initially, Zeke eyed me suspiciously. He was courteous but cautious. One day I was sitting in my car looking at my social media feed on my phone. I have old eyes, so I hold my phone in front of my face instead of looking down at it. The dope man pulled up in his luxury car. Walking to our apartment building, he jokingly accused me of taking pictures of him. I laughed, but something in his probing gaze told me he was only half joking. Let me say up front that I never saw Zeke dealing drugs, but all the signs were there. People knocked on his door at all hours of the day and night, late night. The visits were short, like someone picking up a to-go order from a fast food joint. Zeke introduced me to the neighborhood watchman. Some of the elders spoke highly of him without directly referring to his illicit occupation. They told me how the block had improved because of his efforts. He was the one, they said, who put a stop to break-ins and robberies on the block. To my utter surprise, Zeke told me how he worked with police to get them to respond quicker to complaints of crime or vandalism. Once Zeke found out what I did for a living with the Sweet Potato Project, he became even more friendly and protective. He never confessed to what he did, but he told me about his stints in prison and how much he valued life on the outside. As if we had something in common, Zeke bragged about the young men in the neighborhood he tried to employ through his construction company. Washing his and other neighbors' cars or having them cut grass and pick up trash on the block. Oftentimes, weed-smoking or beer-guzzling youngsters who gravitated to my neighborhood greeted me with a, "What's up, OG?" Oh, gangster. It seemed because I lived next to the dope man, I was given a modicum of respect. I guess Zeke surmised that I wasn't exactly rolling in cash. Whenever he saw me in my car or entering my apartment, he'd reach into his pocket and ask, "You need anything?" I declined his offers, but I was touched by the sentiment. Zeke told me he had a house in the city. He allowed some wildlings to occupy the apartment above me. He gave me his phone number and told me to call if they ever got out of hand, which they did often. One day I heard someone kicking in the front door of one of the units. I called the police. They asked my name and said someone would be there soon. They never showed up, so I called Zeke. He immediately came by, talked to me, inspected the property, and matter-of-factly told me it's handled. About a month later, the owner of the Coupe de Ville called me over as I was taking groceries into my apartment. "You heard about Zeke?" He asked. I told him no. My heart sank as he detailed how Zeke had been shot and killed somewhere in North St. Louis. It was a drug deal gone awry, he reasoned. As we were talking, an elderly lady in an old gray Pontiac pulled up beside us. "Y'all heard about Zeke?" She shouted from her car. My neighbor seemed to know the lady and told me she was related to Zeke. He gave her his condolences. "I loved him," she said, "but he was living that life." Shaking her head, it was bound to happen. That brief exchange made me love my neighborhood even more. I adore being smack dab in the middle of the ghetto life of my youth. As a writer, the way poor people manage to laugh, love, live, and cope among the chaos connects the generational path of poverty, resiliency, and creative survival. Sadly, death is an expected part of this life. Sometimes the lines of existence, of right and wrong, are blurry. Sometimes the bad guys do good things. Sometimes don't ask, don't tell is all part and parcel of surviving and maintaining a delicate balance. Zeke played a valuable but complicated part in this real life melodrama. Comfort came from him and my elderly neighbors, the watchmen. I know they have my back and I have theirs. We all suspected Zeke was living that life, but in a bizarre way, he was the nucleus of our efforts to keep madness outside our doors, even though he was a contributor to that insanity. A couple days ago, I heard the rapid fire brr, brr, brr of automatic weapons somewhere down the block. The gunplay seemed to go on for 10 minutes. No police showed up. During a lull in the noise, I again glanced through the blinds. As I did, a strange, sad thought seeped into my mind. The dope man is dead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvester, and Treasure.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Treasure Shields Redmond, and I am so glad to be here with you this evening. I kind of wanted to talk about what it is like to grow into yourself as a writer. I've had a very interesting writerly life, and I just wanted to take you briefly through how I went from becoming a child who was kind of surrounded by a lot of text and sounds that intrigued me to someone who then began to create their own text and sounds. So I'm going to share my screen and share with you what I'm talking about. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. Oop, there it is. Okay, so the word that I like to use when I talk about different types of writing is register. And register has a lot of meanings. You know, some people use a cash register. Some people go to school and they register, right? Sometimes you say something and people say, oh, I can see that that didn't register with that person. But the register that I'm talking about is a particular part of the range of a voice or instrument. And I like to think about different types of writing, different registers of communication in that way. And one of the reasons that I like to use the word register is because it denotes sound, and I think a lot about sound. And it kind of makes me think that there are sounds and ways of speaking that can only be heard by certain people. You know, there are certain animals that can hear at a register above humans. And here in recent years, there's been studies about how young humans, those below the age of teen years, can hear different sounds and have a wider register range of hearing than those of us who are above the teen years. So I was always working in multiple registers. So I started off as this little girl in the deep South in Meridian, Mississippi. And that is not a picture of me, but it could be. I found her on YouTube. And I thought she was so adorable with her pink and black. Let me tell you, she put together that outfit. So my writing journey began in this place. And when Sylvester before me talked about how, you know, his version of Christianity, my version of Christianity, the church, and all of that, even though we may revise our relationship with those faiths, we can't deny that they gave us kind of speaking and writing skills, and they encouraged us to be creators in certain ways. So I was raised giving speeches at Easter, and surrounding me on the slide are just some of the texts that I watched and listened to and read during the time that I was in my most formative years. I loved the book, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. That was the first book that really, I just felt like she had just been reading my mail. Had she been reading my journal? It was a coming of age story and all about, you know, wanting your first bra and that sort of stuff. Very adorable and endearing upon reflection. I was a big music fan and a big fan of Prince, listened to it on vinyl, ran my finger across it so I could make it play backwards. If you buy the vinyl, you can put it on a turntable, and at a certain point, you can pull the record backwards and hear something that was recorded backwards. So I'll let you do that research. I love James Cleveland's music in church. That was the era of the Black Baptist church I grew up in, and other books, of course, the Bible. Even 1984, I read that in middle school. So I kept being, you know, kept consuming sounds, text, and sights. And then after I had consumed for years, I began to write. So my first strategy for you, if you are a lay writer, is to read a lot, listen a lot, and watch a lot. And so I mostly wrote stories, little poems, and I journaled. I journaled a lot, and I regret that I didn't save some of those old journals. Eventually, I hit the beginning of high school, and a formative moment for me was coming into contact with the movie Crush Groove. This movie. Oh my goodness. It wasn't high film. It wasn't a foreign film. It wasn't an art film. It was such a product of its time, and it chronicled the rise of Russell Simmons and his drive to create what is now Def Jam Records. And on that movie poster, you can see classic rappers from right to left, such as Curtis Blow, Run DMC, the Fat Boys. And there's a great percussionist on the left whose name is Sheila E. Connection. She used to play with Prince's band. And once I saw that movie about hip hop on the East Coast, I was bitten. And for about the next 10 or 15 years, that was primarily the register in which I wrote. I wrote hip hop music and hip hop verse. I formed a group with my best friend there. There's Terrence Davis, also from Meridian, Mississippi. And we were hometown heroes. I mean, we lived the dream. We performed at our own prom. We were tri-state stars. We put out local records. And eventually, we were signed to MC Hammer's record label. And even though that album did not catapult me to fortune and fame, it allowed me to increase my writing chops. So not only was I writing hip hop verse that I would then perform, I began to write songs for other artists. So there was an artist, a female duo, rap duo called Oaktown's 357. I wrote the majority of their second album. I wrote songs for R&B groups and, collaborated on lots of music. And eventually, after I had left college to pursue this dream of being a writer and performer in the music industry, and it fizzled out, I went back to college. So this is just, I'm afraid you all won't be able to hear it. So let me make sure that as I share the screen, that I've optimized it for sound. I learned that if you don't hit this one little thing, you won't be able to hear it. So this is just a snippet of what I looked like in the 90s. You won't be able to hear a lot of the lyrics, but you'll catch the vibe. All right, so there was this time where I thought I would never write in any other register, right? This time that I thought to myself, this is the pinnacle of my gift. But as I continue to experience more and more text in college, that was when I reconnected with the form of poetry that is not hip hop verse. That is when I reconnected with Black arts movement poets, with Harlem Renaissance poets, with modernist and romantic poets, with postmodern American poets. And that part of the register that I had not really worked the muscles on grew. And it became this book that I wrote, and it is called Chop, a collection of Kwansabas for Fannie Lou Hamer. So I'm going to read probably about one or two poems. The poems are very short. But what I wanted to say was, let me go back to the screen so I can see myself. Stop share. That's what I'm trying to do. What I wanted to say was that my story is one of continuing to be focused on your gift and not being so worried about how people feel about the gift, how the gift is being received, if the gift is famous, if the gift is infamous. I kept my my core self, my core writerly self centered so that when I did not become a famous rapper, I was fine because I knew that I was a good writer. And then I went to college and, you know, flexed these journalism chops. And I wrote for the Memphis Flyer after I graduated college. And I continued on to graduate school, received an MFA in poetry. And now I have a PhD in English literature and criticism. But this book Chop, is what I will share with you from tonight. And it is about a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. It centers her voice. It's written in the voice of her, people who loved her, people who witnessed her incredible organic genius. She was a civil rights activist, proto-feminist warrior with this beautiful throaty alto. And she put her life and body on the line for Black people so that they would be enfranchised and be first-class citizens. So this poem, and I'm gonna read one, is called October 16th, 1917, Montgomery County, Mississippi. Boss say I birthed 20 field hands, then give me $50 for a fanny. Done promised this last one to God. Dream I gift her to the priest, took her behind the Holy of Holies, came out full grown and singing, glory. Shook me woke, knowed I've been changed. I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. I know I've been changed. You know the angels in heaven sign my name. Now I sing in between the poems because that's what Fannie Lou Hamer would do. And usually when I read and perform these works, I pepper it with freedom songs and bits of spirituals and gospels to help tell the story of this incredible and not as well sung member of the revolutionary avant-garde of the 60s. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine. I'm so honored to be on this panel and also so honored to follow all of these brilliant speakers. I told Treasure this, but I taught the class in the spring called Black Lives Matter Art Theory Practice, where we, among other contents, engaged CHOP. And actually what we did, Treasure, is in Seattle, there's this Black Lives Matter mural where each letter was painted by an artist. And we read your book of poetry. Then I asked the students to pair one poem with one of the letters and curate kind of a multi-genre show and talk about like how the meanings in your poetry resonated with the different letters in the mural. So it's just amazing to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you, Sylvia, for making this space, and thank you all for being here in this virtual space. I'm going to read a little bit from the essay that's coming up in the Common Reader edition edited by Iver Bernstein and Heidi Kolk, and then I'll talk a little bit more about my writing. So I'll go ahead and read. Reflective, shiny and light, smooth and almost slick to the touch. This is a mirror's materiality, fingerprints, oil traces from a finger's touch, also mark mirrors that have been touched and held. This materiality prompts questions. How does a mirror's sensorial purpose, how does a mirror's sensorial purpose to reflect frame how senses are trained and oriented? How does a mirror reflect and organize and reflect how concepts of beauty are illuminated? When a mirror fails, when it cracks, how does the failure situate aesthetics? A casket's materiality also prompts questions. A box often constructed with wood, a casket functions to hold a dead body. How do the materials, function, and aesthetics of a casket give meaning to a body that has lived and died? These questions animate Mirror Casket, a coffin covered with mirrors. The object was constructed in late summer 2014 by 7 St. Louis-based artists, headed by DeAndrea Nichols. And you can read a little bit more about this, but this is kind of the beginning of the essay I write for the common reader about 3 works of Black art that immediately followed the 2014 uprising in Ferguson, following the murder of Michael Brown, to think about the sensorial work that this art did. Artists, I think when I teach about art, I talk about the word aesthetics, and the word aesthetics comes from the Greek same kind of word, aesthetics, which means perception or senses. And so when I think about art at its most powerful, we can think about how art organizes our senses, and especially in this sense, organizes our senses to differently remember and to imagine new worlds. This piece that I write about, and you can see the image here, I think organizes our senses to care for this this person who died, whose body was treated with so much horribly by the police. It reflected community members, people in the image of it, and the image of the mirrors. In my essay, I talk about how the protesters walked with this piece from the site of Michael Brown's murder to the Ferguson Police Department, so we can think about kind of the sensorial engagements that came in that walk. I'm going to read a little bit more from the essay, where I talk about another piece called Hands Up. Early in 2014, blades of grass stretched to ordinary heights of 2 and 3 and 4 inches tall. Amid these blades stand not so ordinary objects, pairs of arms. Each pair was a, quote, lawn sculpture, end quote, representing human arms and hands. Each rose some 2 feet tall. Each appeared as a flattened 2-dimensional representation in black. Each began in the grass, seemingly where the elbow would start. Most sculptures ended 2 to 3 feet off the ground with fingertips of each hand outstretched. Others varied, one hand with outstretched fingers and the other hand with fingers in closed fists. This was Hands Up, sculptures by Damon Davis and Basil Kincaid. Damon Davis had worked on the mirror casket and All Hands on Deck. Kincaid is a fellow St. Louis-based artist, and more about kind of his work there. And I'll continue a little bit more of the writing, and you can kind of see the image of the work as well. These sculptures were, and you can think about the sensorial work of this work. These sculptures were installed in 2014 on lawns of homes in St. Louis and in Walker Park in Kirkwood, Missouri, near the home of St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCullough. There was a stillness, altered naturalness, and quiet resistance to Hands Up. These were cut from wood after Damon Davis and Basil Kincaid traced their arms and hand. These sculptures mark public geographies in dialogue with the prosecution of Darren Wilson and juridical geographies of segregation. I'll just read at the very end. The installation in Kirkwood suggested a sensorial geographic dimension to segregation. Decisions that affect Black life are often made far from Black people. So just kind of thinking about this is kind of how I write, and in this case, thinking about the sensorial element of this work. I want to just talk a little bit. Sylvia gave us some great questions, so I included one here. I want to talk a little bit about my journey to becoming a writer, and this question, are writers born, or can that talent be developed, whether early or later in life? And definitely the latter. I think that talent is developed. I was someone actually growing up, I was really, really good at math. And my parents, who actually, I live in Seattle now, but my mom is from Mississippi. My dad's from Newark, New Jersey. My parents actually met in St. Louis, lived in St. Louis for a few years. And then I was lucky enough to be a postdoctoral fellow at WashU from 2016 to 2018. And St. Louis is my favorite city. I talked to everyone about it, and I was just there a few weeks ago. But I, growing up, was really good at math, but always was attracted to writing. And so I kind of in college swerved to start focusing on my writing. I went to Harvard and I wrote for the Harvard Crimson newspaper, became an editor. After college, I moved to New York and I worked for this Brooklyn-based newspaper called the Williamsburg Greenpoint News and Arts, where I wrote about the arts in the aughts, the mid-2000s. I then, during the Great Recession, was unemployed and started this magazine, The Arts Politics, with friends. And then in the last few years, I've been writing regularly for the South Seattle Emerald, where I'm based now. And it's a Black-owned newspaper that's been around for 7 years that does amazing coverage. And I really think about writing, one of my favorite phrases is that there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting. That's how I teach for my students, but that's also how I think about myself, not only as someone who writes through revision, but also the fact that writing processes, even though we often have our single author, our name on, our single byline, writing is always a collaborative process, be it being copy edited, and I noticed a few typos in my last piece, so I look forward to copy edits, to content editors, to the ways in which this is happening right now, and Sylvia making this space and us all in conversation together. So I think great writers are made, they're developed, and they're developed in conversation, they're developed with editing, and they're developed with revision. And then the other thing I'll just say is I have a PhD from Northwestern in performance studies. And in that program, I worked with amazing scholars of color, including Disowini Madison, Ramon Rivera Severa, E. Patrick Johnson, Joss Chambers-Letson, all who encourage me and my colleagues to write frequently about the arts. And that kind of writing frequently builds in the practice of writing, the practice of revision, the practice of throwing like not great stuff on the page, but maybe you get a gem out of it, and also builds the capacity to look with and sit with art and performance in really capacious ways. I want to close my comments talking a little bit about this theme of hidden. And one of the things I want us to think about is hidden to whom? And when we use these words, who do we center and decenter? I curated this show last year. It would have opened on campus at Seattle University. And actually, a lot of the art was shipped to Seattle University. I actually had Dee Nichols' art in my house. Damon Davis' art was on campus, and we had to ship it back. It would have opened April 2nd, 2020 on our campus as a kind of a in-person visual art show. But we transitioned it to a show, and I'll chat out the link to it, a show, a virtual exhibition. So this was a show I curated kind of based off my time in St. Louis, just loving the city, loving the artists, featuring 5 Black artists kind of from or living in the St. Louis region: Dominic Chambers, Damon Davis, Jen Everett, Dee Nichols, and Catherine Simone Reynolds. And with COVID, we transitioned to an online show that I'm going to show you a preview of in a bit. But we also did things thinking about this kind of hidden, how do we engage stories? We also wanted to engage with these artists and their works in myriad ways. So we made studio visit videos that are still on the website. I kind of hired a few undergrads and graduates to be my curatorial assistants, and they made education guides. We had online events, and we had a research guide to kind of honor their work. So with that, I wanted just to close showing that show a little bit, to think about how we might center kind of these hidden histories, and also to think about writing beyond just kind of the monograph or kind of the book you buy, but the power of writing in curatorial text. So this is the show, the beginning of the virtual exhibition. And I had 7 themes. This first is Dominic Chambers' really, really beautiful and meaningful work, I'll Be Your Shadow, You Be My Shade. And one of the things I did in curating this show, I interviewed all of the artists. And throughout the curatorial language, I incorporated quotes from my interviews. So you got my take as the curator, and I did aesthetic analysis, but you also got their stories. What does it mean to kind of have Chambers say, he told me working on paper became a bit of a necessity because, like most artists starting out, I was very poor. I made a lot of work in my apartment at the time, and thinking about kind of how he talks about paper and materiality. This is work by Damon Davis, thinking about how he talks about this. So with that, I'll close. And I just want to again thank Sylvia and thank everyone for making space for this and making space to listen to all of us talk about writing in St. Louis. And I'll hand it back to Sylvia.
Thank you so much. I want to hear applause. We are not all in a room together where we can have that sonic experience, but it's really such a fantastic set of presentations. And I think we already have some great questions coming through. So yeah, and I want to remind people to please use the Q&A button, which is in the black bar at the bottom of your screen. It's different from the chat, and that's where we're going to be collecting our questions from. So just thanks to all of you for the deep sharing that you've done and the great material that you've given us to think about. So I would like to start with a question here. Thank you all for bringing, this is from a participant, Joseph Frank. Thank you all for bringing more Black voices in St. Louis to the forefront. What would you suggest non-Black writers and aspiring writers can do to help amplify Black voices in writing about St. Louis? And I invite anyone to, any of the presenters to jump in here.
Was the question, what can aspiring writers do to amplify? Okay.
Correct.
Oh, what would you suggest non-Black writers?
Yeah, or
to amplify Black voices.
Yeah, or I think it's also, the question is, or any aspiring writers to help amplify,
That's an interesting question. I'm always interested when white, you know, our fellow white humans ask us for ways to help them help us.
Yeah.
Because generally when I want to help somebody, I don't run out of ideas. It's pretty easy for me to generate ideas for how to help people. So I'm going to let other people answer that if they would like to, but I'll end by saying, when you ask someone to tell you how to help them, that puts the labor on them. And if they need help, they also don't need to more labor of trying to figure out how to help you help them.
I agree. And I think if you want to be an advocate, I think you have to listen and observe. And I think probably see where you can fit in and where you need to help. But I think basically you need to listen to those people that you're trying to help. And then I think you have a good idea of what you have to do next.
Thank you.
I can just add, one of my mentors, Sweeney Madison, whose daughter, Turquoise C. Dyson, has art in the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis right now. Amazing show. Sweeney Madison's kind of the, she's written this book called Critical Ethnography, which is like a deep listening method. And one of the things I always think about is how am I in relation to who I'm writing about. I have students who are students of color, non-Black students of color that are like, oh, I can't write about Black artists. And I'm like, why not? Rather than thinking that, ask yourself, what relationship am I in? How might I be in relationship? How might I be in ethical relationship? What does it mean for me, a Black person who lives in Seattle, to write about Black artists in St. Louis? How can I be ethical given that distance? If I were in the same city, how could I be ethical given the closeness? So I think deep listening, and I also think about how are you in good relationship? How can you be in good relationship? How can you be in ethical relationship with those that you write about? It's a question that I ask myself when I do my writing. And one thing I'll say I do, especially in writing for the newspaper, I've been sending before things go to print, I send, especially when I cover artists of color, I send them copies before it goes to print. I send them to it before I send it to the editor. I'm like, this is what I wrote about you. Any changes? And so that relationship's changed. They're not like shocked by a newspaper, sensationalizing them, but rather thinking about the newspaper as a space that they can tell their story well. So I just thinking about that relationship to me is something that's important.
I want to comment on that as well. I think, Jasmine, I subscribe to your perspective that so much of the writing, especially nonfiction or, when we're telling other people's stories, that relationship and that the ethics of that relationship are so, the responsibilities of that relationship are so important. And I like that what you all have raised here is a series of questions in answer to this question. I think that's very instructive. Thank you. So let's see. There's a question here for Ms. Gibson from Shanika Lockhart. How did you decide what to add to your stories and where to begin?
Well, the stories actually were a lot of stories that I wrote over a long period of time. And probably that was the major part of the developmental editing process, was to go through all of these stories and to try to figure out how to knit them together and which ones were important, which ones could perhaps be combined, because I wrote them over a long period of time and I really didn't view them as potential for a book until I started in a writing workshop and just started workshopping the stories and getting feedback and critiques, and they started coming together and started growing and really came together themselves. So it was a process for sure. Some of them, many of them were very, very short stories. That actually, at the very, very beginning, many of them were paragraphs and notes on the backs of envelopes and napkins and that sort of thing over a long period of time. But just figuring out how to make it all flow seamlessly was the initial process of editing.
Thank you, Vivian. I have a question here for Sylvester. I think I think it came in when he was talking. Did your developing persuasive techniques to connect with strangers, I think when you were talking about Jehovah's Witness, to persuade them of the value of your faith, and did these techniques contribute to your advertising work? I might add, did it also contribute to the kind of writing that you do? And how powerful is it to have someone like yourself, the hero of a story like Malcolm X?
Good question. Yeah, I still think that technique of getting to that individual, trying to find out what makes him or her tick. What's your passion? What's your question? What's your story? What's your backstory? I still think I employ that today. My job right now at the St. Louis American is my fellowship is covering COVID's impact on the Black community. And thankfully, it's a narrative job. They want me to do it from a narrative perspective, not just statistics and stats, but to actually show how it's impacting people. So with this, I've been talking to people about losing loved ones, about having COVID. And I find that I gotta get them to really trust me. So it's in the conversations before the interview and after the interview, really more after the interview than before the interview, that you get the juice, the nuggets. Because by the time the interview is over, you've developed a rapport and they kind of trust you. And they'll tell you the things that they are thinking, but were afraid to have in print. But then at the end of the interview, they kind of trust you. In fact, I had some people say, I trust you will handle this well. So it is that dance. It is that desire to really know what people want. Now, to the Malcolm X question, I don't see myself like Malcolm. I do see myself as a chronicler, somebody whose job it is to tell these stories of the people who look like me and who shared experiences like me. That's been my mantra and my goal, from the time I started in this business to now. I'm still telling stories.
Thank you. So this is a good one for the group as a whole from Lena Crown. What stories do you think have yet to be told about St. Louis, or what stories would you want to see told in a different way? It's a big question.
I would go back, not to hog this time, but I would go back to Vivian's book. She's telling an important story of a slice of time in St. Louis. Now, ironically, we're going through another important time. The NGA, the National Geospatial Agency, is being built in the same area of Pruitt-Igoe, same area, close to Mill Creek. I predict that folks are going to be moved out of the way. Communities will go, schools will go, histories will go. So chronicling that move in that neighborhood, because the imprint of that NGA is right in Black communities all over the place. So chronicling that now, watching that now, documenting that now, I think is very important.
Yeah, and maybe another twist on this question is what kinds of upcoming projects are you working on that do exactly this, explore other stories that haven't been told yet?
I can offer, I think, two answers. First, I think thinking about that question with audience. So being in Seattle, Seattle's fastest growing city, very, Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing. And also I teach a class this summer called Public Policy in the Arts. I also think Seattle could learn a lot from St. Louis. I just visited a few weeks ago, and I tell everyone in Seattle how amazing it is that in St. Louis, you walk into museums and they're free. And that's from this tax policy that was established in the 70s, how there's, festivals every summer and people gather together. And obviously St. Louis, there's problems, but there's a relationality in St. Louis that I think a lot of cities could learn from that gets dwarfed because of the ways in which kind of headlines about St. Louis maybe talk about one thing. So thinking about that, thinking about what other cities can learn from St. Louis, from its arts community, from its Black communities, from its relationality. And then I think the second thing I'll name is I'm working on a book based off the show I curated to kind of tell further stories about these artists. I'm someone who I feel like art is the most important thing to our world. Art is human expression. It's ways of making meaning both within writing and within things beyond writing. And so for me, that book about the exhibition is kind of extending this. How do we make space for artists, their stories, the ways in which they express the histories they unearth, and then the possibilities they imagine? How do we make space for that to be treated seriously and with care? So those are kind of just two things I'm thinking about.
I think I want to bring everybody onto the screen here.
I wanted to kind of respond to those questions too. So the first one was, what do you think what stories should we kind of push forward at this time? And it's interesting because as a lot of us know, March of last year was when things kind of shut down. And there was this incredible documentary that was released March of last year. And I'm going to read, I feel bad for them. I want them to have a relaunch because the story is so important. Well, actually it came out in 2018, but they were gonna have a relaunch with more funding in March of last year. So it's called Target St. Louis, and it's about the secret history of the U.S. Army aerosol radiation test in segregated neighborhoods of North St. Louis during the Cold War. Yeah. And I would love to hear Sylvester talk about the ways in which real lived recent history affect our suspiciousness regarding the medical establishment and the state. I think that oftentimes the narrative about Black people not wanting to get the vaccine is so reductive, and it's so like, Black people scared to go to the doctor, like that sort of thing, when actually there are living grandmothers and grandfathers with information that would make you suspicious of the state and of the medical establishment. Because of course, there has to be a collusion in St. Louis for this to go off as it had to. There had to be a medical establishment that knew not to reveal that this is why you were experiencing the symptoms you were experiencing, so that they could see it play out for whatever amount of time that the US government wanted to see how radiation helped, harmed, or other.
Treasure, I believe some of those experiments were in Pruitt-Igoe.
Definitely.
Yes. So Sylvester.
Yeah, definitely.
What I've learned is that that paranoia, those feelings are real. And it's not just because of Tuskegee and not because of the gassing. It's because of experiences in the emergency room. It's because young men who are shot, they have no place, there's no emergency units to treat them. It's because people have taken their Black relatives to doctors and hospitals and have received shoddy treatment. They don't trust the medical system. I think what COVID did was expose a whole lot of stuff that I hope we deal with. And one of the things, so happy you brought that up, because it's shocking to me how deeply embedded this fear and this mistrust of the medical community is. But they've been telling me why. You know, they have gone to doctors who didn't give them the proper treatment and their parent died from cancer. They have gone to doctors because they didn't have the right kind of money, could not get the right kind of treatment. Those stories go back to, you know, we talk and we regurgitate those stories. And so it's real, it's real. And one thing I wanted to add about stories we need to tell. African Americans are now we have been the highest disproportionately hit demographic of COVID, just as we were with the 2008 through 2010, I think it was, housing shutdown, just devastated our net worth across the country. COVID has devastated our communities, our businesses, and our families. So telling those stories of how we rebuild, how we can rebuild, how we can come back stronger, and how we can address all these disparities and discrepancies and inequities, I think that's the job of young journalists, young writers out there, to go out there and tell those human stories that may happen to have a Black face on it.
Thank you. Anyone else on this question? We have only 12 minutes left in our program, so we'll take a couple of more questions and then conclude. And I also, if you guys have any comments that you wanted to offer to each other, from your essentially questions about each other's presentations. I meant to do that at the start of our Q&A, apologize. So there's a specific question here for Vivian about some of the pictures that you showed at the start in your presentation. Jennifer McCoy asks, I'm curious about the houses that seem to be a row of similar houses on Filer between Morganford and Alfred. Were they built as company housing?
No, first of all, Mill Creek was the oldest part of the city. The city started at what is now the Arch and grew west and north and south. And so just about all the immigrants who came into the city came into Mill Creek. They lived there first. When Black people moved into that housing, beginning maybe at the turn of the century, 1920, those houses were already 100 years old. There was no plumbing. European immigrants moved in, moved west, left those houses for Blacks to be segregated in. But there were some beautiful homes there because it was where everyone began. So those houses are the very same housing stock that's in Lafayette Square, that's in Soulard, the very same houses built around the same time. So when they decided that those houses, beginning as early as 1907, when comprehensive plans began about how the city would be improved. It was all smoky and there were packing houses and the actual Mill Creek was contaminated with a cholera epidemic, became the railroad tracks that are there now going into Union Station. That's where the actual creek was. And St. Louis grew up around that creek. But that housing stock, if there was some interest in keeping that stock, it was basically a land grab. They decided that, okay, now we want this land back. We have segregated these people here. We won't let them go anywhere else. But it's adjacent to Union Station. And when people come into Union Station, we don't want them to see this slum that was made into a slum. So the housing stock was some of it very, very grand. Some of it was old. We lived in dilapidated housing that, was neglected. Many of the homes did not have indoor plumbing, but not nearly 80%, as the Post-Dispatch said. There were maybe 25% were still outdoor plumbing. But the housing was neglected for a reason, because that land was needed by the city. And so they allowed those beautiful homes to deteriorate. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. I have another question here for Sylvester. A comment that's for me one of Mr. Brown's most memorable columns from his post-dispatch career spoke to the theme of repair of the world and human condition. Could he speak to that theme in relationship to this initiative?
The initiative being the Superhero Project?
Right, I'm not certain, but that's probably when the question came in.
You know, it's I know it's a long way around. I'll be quick as possible. That little Jehovah's Witness boy is still in me. I'm still knocking on doors and trying to save souls. So yeah, I do use my writing, and I did especially a lot of it would take 5 and at the post to simply speak to and for humanity. You know, that we all have this power to save a soul. We all have this power to change a life. My life was changed by people who just gave a damn, who said, kid, you got something special. Oh man, you got something special. So the Sweet Potato Project initiative was all about giving kids the chance to do for self now, while they're in high school, while they're, you know, maybe in college. Grow something, turn it into a product, make some money. What they do with that is up to them. You know, they can go up to go into the music business like Treasure did. They can use to go into any endeavor we're going into. But the idea was just to light that fire at a young age and validate their creativity. And once you do that, I believe you are giving them the potential to save somebody else.
Great, thank you. And I just realized I'm almost out of power on my computer. I think we're going to make it to the finish. Let's see. Just see what the later questions have been here. Practical question for Dr. Mahmoud. As you are good at math, did you have pressure to cash in and pursue a well-paying career path that utilizes math skills? How were you able to support yourself while following your dream of artistic expression, which seems is often less well compensated?
I'll try to be short because I feel like there's a longer story, but I'll say now I'm teaching at SALU. I'm starting at University of Washington in the fall. And at SALU University, I teach in an arts leadership program. It's like an arts management program, both undergrads and graduates. And actually in Seattle, there are a lot of, so two-pronged, there's a lot of arts industry jobs, working in a museum, working for a performing arts center that pay pretty well. And so that's kind of, I love teaching my program. I love being a Black faculty in my program. And I'm actually curating a show with former students, Black artists in the fall, because I love showing students of color that there is a path. At the same time, when I'm a huge arts advocate, I was appointed by the governor of our state as a Washington State Arts Commissioner. And one of the things I advocate for continually is paying artists for their labor. I think for too long, we all know how artists, it's like, oh, do this for free or this or that. Something I advocate for, and with a lot of the kind of arts policy that's happening now at a federal level, there's been talk of like the WPA style of paying artists. And so it's something that I both kind of work with now, but also advocate for. And I guess my kind of trek is a longer story, but I will say that I pursued my PhD because a lot of PhDs, this was during the Great Recession. I couldn't get a full-time job, and a lot of PhDs are stipended. So I actually went into a PhD program that allowed me to pursue and engage in the arts because it was a paycheck for 5 years. It was a meager paycheck of $21K a year, but I was able to live off of it. So it's a kind of balance for me, but also I think about that in terms of advocacy. How do we advocate for a world that we want to build? And I want to build a world where artists, especially Black artists, are being paid.
Thank you. All right. I think we're going to wrap up on that last question there. And I just want to thank everyone again for the panelists for their generous participation tonight. We are in a stormy weekend here in St. Louis, and ironically, because we are both without power, we've ended up here at the campus so that we could actually have Wi-Fi and electricity. So that was just an unexpected, happy kind of wrinkle in today's plan, a good wrinkle. So anyway, it's been my great pleasure to host all of you tonight, and our amazing audience with your great questions. Thank you so much. And I wish everyone good work and good health. And we'll all, we'll see each other at some of these, the audience, and we'll see each other at some of the upcoming programs that we have in our series. So thank you all very much. Lots of virtual applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Jasmine, for telling me about that incredible project you all did with my work.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That just warms my heart. I will come to Seattle in a heartbeat too. Just call me.
I would love all of you to come to Seattle. You all are so brilliant, and I'm honored to be on this panel with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Pleasure meeting you all.
Yeah.
Pleasure meeting you too.
Pleasure meeting you.